A society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. A Greek proverb from a time long before the problems of our modern economies or the study of economics itself is as true today as it was thousands of years ago. But do we truly live by this idea? For the first time since the Industrial Revolution, successive generations are not richer than their parents. While there have been returns in historical atypical values, this trend has held overall for most populations in developed economies. For a long time, it was expected that children would have a better standard of living than their parents in adulthood. However, nowadays, most young professionals can only aspire to lead the same lifestyle as their parents. Younger generations find it increasingly difficult to secure reliable jobs, afford comfortable homes, start families, and save for retirement. This is despite the world being much richer now than at any time in the 20th century when the baby boomers were building their fortunes. So, what's happening? How is it possible that a globally richer world produces poorer generations than the previous ones? Is there an underlying cause, and if so, can it be reversed? If not, does that mean we can expect every generation from now on to be poorer than the last? And I suppose it's worth asking, does it even matter since everyone is going to die and inherit their wealth anyway? Here's a question for all of you. Is it better to be born in a large cohort with many people of the same age as you, or in a small cohort with few people of the same age? Traditional economic theory would suggest that a small cohort is preferable because it means less competition for employment, housing, social programs, places in good schools, and at the macroeconomic level, less competition for basic things like natural resources. But how does that explain the population explosion that, despite being part of the largest demographic explosion in history, is overall very rich? Lord David Willetts, a British politician, demographer, and writer, suggests that the opposite may be true. Being part of a larger cohort in a demographic system is actually preferable because it gives that group more voting power on generational issues and more influence in markets. When the boomers were young, they voted for policies that benefited them: cheap or free higher education, family support systems, and a strong welfare state. When they reached the pinnacle of their careers, their voting patterns changed. And this large voting bloc was now in favor of lower income taxes, less business regulation, more protection for national industry to prevent outsourcing and global competition, and on a smaller scale, zoning laws to protect home values. The push towards suburbs with mandatory single-family construction requirements meant that houses became larger, and good locations became more desirable. In the 1950s, houses were essentially a commodity, with most spending going towards building the structure itself. It wasn't unreasonable for family cars to cost more than the family home. 50 years later, houses are both an investment and a place to live in old age. Boomers started voting for retirement benefits, pension plans, medical infrastructure, and the elimination of estate taxes, even if it meant going against the plans that served them in their youth. Of course, David Willetts' work specifically focuses on the UK, and I know there are people who vote for the common good rather than their own interest, but on average, you can easily see this trend over the last half-century in most advanced economies. In my country, Australia, for example, the 2019 federal elections were largely decided by a policy decision that would reduce the fiscal efficiency of Australian retirement accounts. The party advocating for maintaining the favorable tax structure ended up winning primarily thanks to older Australian voters. Recently, we just had another election where the opposition party reversed its plan to change taxes on retirement accounts, and they won. A study on the 2017 British elections found that conservative votes had shifted from being divided between rich and working class to being divided between young and old. Much of what I've commented on so far comes directly from Willetts' book, The Pinch, and it's definitely worth reading if you're interested in these demographic processes. Now, an entire lifetime of favorable government policies can be enormously beneficial for wealth creation. Imagine how much better millennials might fare on average if they received free or more affordable higher education. This would be the difference many young people need to afford a home deposit. And this brings us to the next big topic to consider, the housing gap. David Willetts' small cohort theory probably overlooks, or at least doesn't emphasize, an important detail that gave boomers another advantage over successive generations. It's not just that they could buy houses when they were cheap. Certainly, that didn't hurt. It's more a symptom than a major problem. They were a large cohort in a small world. They had all the voting power and barely any competition. In the 1950s and 60s, the world's population was roughly a third of what it is now. And let's face it, if you were a white man in the countries we're focusing on, your competition was even less. Add up all the apparent downsides we've referred to before. And in reality, there was less competition for everything, including jobs, because employers had a smaller labor pool to choose from. Women's participation in the workforce was very low, further reducing supply and hence the bargaining power of workers. But it also meant they typically took care of household tasks, reducing family expenses on things like childcare, food, and general upkeep. These relatively higher incomes combined with lower expenses meant that houses could often be paid off with just 1 year's income. Yes, they had to endure higher interest rates, especially in the 70s and 80s, which were the decades of the highest home buying, but it didn't make as much of a difference as it does today. The median house price in the US in 1985 was $82,000. That's the median. So 50% of homes like the ones first homebuyers would be looking for would be cheaper than that. But let's keep it simple and go with the $82,000. Adjusted for median household income, that $82,000 becomes $103,000. The average mortgage rate at the time was 15%, so about $15,000 per year. In some years, it was higher, but most borrowers looked at an absolute maximum of around 15%, so that's the worst case scenario. Nowadays, the median home costs $430,000, and the average interest rate is slightly over 5%, which is about $21,500 a year just for interest payments. Once again, this is adjusted for median income of the time, so it seems quite comparable at first glance. After all, perhaps younger generations shouldn't complain that housing is unaffordable. Many people dismiss this comparison, saying that inflation at the time was extremely high, so these higher interest repayments meant nothing. But that's not true. The inflation in 1985 was 8.43%, and although it reached 13.5% in 1980, it was the inflation of the Consumer Price Index, not housing inflation. Housing prices during those decades grew at a relatively modest rate. Everything else was becoming more expensive. This is more or less the opposite of what we expect today, where housing price growth outpaces inflation. But that wasn't the case in the 1980s. So if the argument of inflation is not entirely fair, is it fair to complain about how easy it was for baby boomers to buy a house? Well, it wasn't easy for two other major reasons. It's not what you would expect, but high interest rates helped them save money for a deposit in an account paying 10% per year, really accelerating that goal. Higher interest rates also ensured that housing prices never became too high because quotas would become unaffordable. In our earlier example, we only considered interest payments on loans in the two periods, but with mortgages, you also have to repay the principal. Repaying the principal of a $430,000 mortgage over a standard loan term of 30 years would cost $14,300 more per year, so the total annual repayment would be just under $36,000. The 1985 house would have a principal repayment of about $3,000 per year, so the total repayment would be just over $18,000 per year, half of what the 2022 buyer would pay, even though interest rates are 3 times higher. In other words, if repayments remained the same, people who bought a house in 1985 could have it paid off in 5 years instead of 30. Why am I focusing so much on housing? Well, despite being a very important part of life, houses are also uniquely unproductive. Real estate is a unique asset because it produces no value. A house on a block of land may appreciate and provide a home for its owners or rental income to an investor, but it produces nothing. Of course, today there are investments like cryptocurrencies that also produce no value, but their market is tiny compared to the real estate market worldwide, tiny and also irrelevant. If the value of Bitcoin rises to $1 million, well, that's great for those who invest in it, and it would have some minor effects on other markets when people withdraw money to buy whatever the crypto millionaires buy. But it's not going to put anyone on the street. The affordability of housing can do that and can also slow down the progress of entire economies. All economies in the world are still, for better or worse, centered around large centers of economic activity, what a normal person would call a city. If property in these cities becomes too expensive, it's inevitable that workers will keep their jobs there because more and more of their income will go towards paying rent in the short term. This may coincide with higher wages. But then these centers are really only working for the benefit of the fortunate property owners who happen to own properties there. It's unlikely that the money property owners get from their properties will be reinvested in company growth or spent on the usual consumption that keeps those companies running. Instead, it's more likely to be spent on more properties, further increasing market values and the amount of money drawn from productive centers to invest in unproductive assets. The cost of housing also reduces social and geographic mobility. According to a 2020 Pew Research study, 52% of young American adults between the ages of 18 and 28 still live with their parents. It's also reasonable to assume that this figure is higher after 2 years of COVID-driven growth and record housing prices. These young adults are economically tied to where their parents live. If they're offered a job in another city, they'll have to decide whether the pay increase is worth the increase in costs of living alone. If they decide it's not, they lose a good job, and the company loses a productive worker. The concentration of wealth in a specific generation is something that can have very real consequences for entire economies, and these effects will only be more pronounced as populations continue to age. Places like Japan are a clear example, and they don't have the same housing problems as we do in the West. But in the long term, does this matter? I don't want to get too morbid, but people eventually die, and their wealth transfers to their children or some other beneficiary. So, the concentration of wealth in a single generation is at worst a transient issue, the process where baby boomers die and leave their wealth behind. The problem we found was that much of the wealth that is transferred is in the form of private family businesses. In short, the problem is that these small businesses often need the owner to keep running, and the people who inherit these businesses either don't want to or can't run them. Small businesses are a huge part of the economy, and losing them will do a lot of harm. A ray of hope is that heirs can sell these businesses to people who have the skills and desire to run them. Maybe they will sell them to people who have the money they need to buy the business from their own inheritance. The problem here is the kind of people who will really receive this money. Most people don't receive money from their parents' inheritance until they themselves are quite old, often approaching the end of their careers or starting retirement. If the money comes to them, it's most likely they'll use it to fund their own retirement and then pass it on to their older children. If the money accumulates in the hands of older people, young people will have fewer opportunities to do all the things they do to build an economy that works. Buy a house, get a good job, start a family. For there to be a continuous supply of workers making an economy work, you can't have an economy with people waiting to get old enough to do something with their lives. Economists call it the intergenerational wealth problem. I like to call it the Prince Charles paradox, but it's something we're going to have to address. Solutions are often proposed, such as wealth and inheritance taxes, but even if they were to work, they would be very unpopular among the massive voting bloc that brought us here in the first place. The last thing we need to ask ourselves is whether this is all the fault of the boomers. I know it's fun to argue a bit between generations, but blaming one generation for our current economic problems won't be very productive. Voting in self-interest and having policies enacted in the interest of the majority is the foundation of democracy, and I don't think anyone can reasonably argue that this is a bad thing. I also think it's very important to see examples of economies where this hasn't happened. China, the second largest economy in the world, is a great example. Their generation of baby boomers is locally known as the lost generation because they spent most of their working lives in a dysfunctional economic system. They were also too old to truly benefit from the rapid economic expansion that took place in the decades following the start of economic openness. This meant that despite still being a significant part of the population, they didn't enjoy the same economic prosperity as their Western counterparts. Economic prosperity was also something that the baby boomers enjoyed and weren't necessarily under their control. The latter half of the 20th century was historically very peaceful. The world opened up to international trade, and growth accelerated thanks to the abundance of cheap energy in the form of fossil fuels. It was a good time to be wealthy, and people did, which is probably the final piece of this puzzle. Once people become extremely rich, and I'm talking about billionaires and billionaires, they usually don't become poor again. The group of billionaires from this generation tears apart these figures to make them look worse than they really are. Remember that in a group with 1 billionaire and 999 completely ruined people, the average member of the group is a millionaire. Most billionaires are quite older, and those people will have a disproportionate impact on their generational wealth statistics. Again, if we look at billionaires by age in China, a country where the general population's vote doesn't really happen in the traditional sense, we can clearly see that wealth comes from periods of strong economic conditions, not just from having the ability to bend public policy to suit you and your peers. Although, of course, I'm sure it doesn't hurt. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave a comment. Also, please consider liking and subscribing. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.